On August 8th, fan favorite Femboy Bridget was announced and released as DLC for hit fighting game Guilty Gear Strive. Immediately, fans uncovered evidence the character was now transgender, most notably voice clips where Bridget says "I'm a girl" in both English and Japanese. For most people, their reaction was, "Oh, okay, she's trans." However, there was a smaller yet still quite vocal section of the internet who remained skeptical of this. It was possible that there was missing context, or that the localization somehow changed the true meaning of the dialogue, or that this was part of a non-canon ending or something like that. Throughout the following month, the Bridget skeptics would seek to prove their points. Since we're here in the future, we know for sure that they were wrong. During a developer's backyard that came out early September 14th, series creator Daisuke Ishiwatari confirmed that Bridget identifies as a woman and clarified her pronouns as she. Strive director Akira Katano additionally stated that all endings were canon. This so thoroughly dismantled every counter-argument that the discourse almost immediately fell off. The few remaining squabblers could only contest whether it was a masterpiece or shit writing, or if they did to pander to the West or to pander to China, what the fuck? But during that 36-day period after the reveal but before the backyard, what took place was the biggest, most awful, longest-lasting discourse over a trans character that I've ever seen. If you're watching this in the far future, or you were simply on the peaceful side of Twitter when this went down, I genuinely cannot overstate the scale of this. Thousands of people were talking about Bridget every single day, arguing with each other for a month straight. The hot takes were omnipresent, the toxicity insurmountable. And I guess the question to be asked is, what the hell is going on here, and why? Dimitri Monroe is what you might call a representative sample for what I want to talk about today. He's a bit of a figurehead in anime and femboy communities, and he has made videos that touch upon character gender debates before, but never one where it was the main subject until, that is, his video about Bridget. This video basically delivers most of the same arguments made by Bridget skeptics for the past month, but in a format that's much more complete and polished and digestible, at least relative to Twitter slap fights or other videos made on the subject.
In Japanese, he's specifically referred to as an otakanoko.
Yeah, y'all knew this one.
We anime fans, or we gamers, trust me, I play video games a lot. I've been playing video games ever since I was actually 2 years old.
I don't have the greatest Japanese, but you can look it up yourself. I could look, this didn't even take very long to find. This was just a few years ago. Bridget has always been meant to be, gotcha, you jacked off to Bridget. I got you. You jacked off the Boku no Pico. It's okay. You know what? I still gotta watch Boku no Pico. I was afraid I was gonna get a boner, so I didn't watch, but I might get a boner. I was afraid.
Though despite being a cut above the rest of its kind, this video suffers from the same fatal flaw, that being, he was wrong. Not just about the conclusion, and not just for the time either, but every argument it was built upon blatant falsehoods, misleading information, unsourced claims, and lies by omission. It was like, holistically wrong. But not only did he make the video in the first place, he just decided to stand by it, keeping the video up while only removing the conclusion. And I think this is a video to which I can make an example of, not just for discussions surrounding Bridget, but about discussions of trans characters, femboy characters, or any gender-ambiguous characters in general. And not just for the individual arguments that come up during these sorts of debates, but for the attitudes behind them. And before we start, I want to clarify, this video is primarily meant to be a look at Dimitri's video as it pertains to a broader discussion, not a personal attack on him specifically. I only intend to bring up the facts not evident from this video when I believe them to be relevant, such as Dimitri's fluency in Japanese, or if it's funny. Where to start on this one? I guess the first place would be with the title. The original title to Dimitri's video was, "What is Bridget's gender identity? The Japanese perspective." The second part was eventually changed to the Japanese fanbase's perspective, and then the whole title changed to the Bridget controversy from the Japanese fanbase's perspective, and then finally, the Bridget controversy, the negative reactions from US to JP. He's already received a lot of criticism for this title, which is probably why he changed it so much, but it's worth talking about why it was a little clickbaity. Dimitri only cites 9 Japanese Twitter users, and that's if you include Mombat. Many of these are set together as a backdrop to specific claims very sparingly throughout the video. Additionally, many of the claims originate from non-Japanese sources. For example, you can see this thread by Smug Kai Supreme that started on August 9th as an origin point for many of the claims Dimitri repeats, but Kai is an American who does not know Japanese. Also, he is very stupid. So if this video isn't entirely filled with a Japanese perspective, is the perspective of the Japanese people included at least significant? Like, are these people Guilty Gear veterans here to provide insight on the franchise? Are they cross-dressers and transgender people who are intimately aware of the culture? Are they bilingual experts of both languages who can convey what context is missing or what was changed? Are they at least general community figureheads who can be said to speak for many more than just themselves? None of this is made clear because they're never elaborated on besides a tweet or two, and from what I can gather, it's not even clear if any of these people have played the game in question. That's something I think Dimitri should have taken care to communicate. It's also well worth mentioning that the perspective Dimitri presents does not reflect the entire perspective of the Japanese fan base. This can be seen in many places. For example, on Japanese Wikipedia, a frequent editor updated a page to mention that Bridget was trans in the newest game. This kicked off an edit war where it was English-speaking users reverting the edit and Japanese users fixing it. On the Pixiv Dictionary, which is a site I believe also accurately reflects the opinions of Japanese fan communities, it mentioned that Bridget was transgender long before the Japanese backyard. There was also multiple articles talking about the situation and mentioning that Bridget is transgender. One of the best, I think, to illustrate that this wasn't a niche view is this Together article, which compiled tweets from Japanese Twitter users calling Bridget trans. I even found this one article from CrowClaw109 that tries to counter the claim that Bridget was made trans because of Western political correctness, made all the way back in August 15th. Because that's how far the debate over there progressed in that much time. There's a lot more individual people I could reference, but I think this speaks for itself. The idea that Bridget was unanimously seen as a femboy by the Japanese fan base is not true. The landscape of debate was similar to the one in English-speaking communities, where some people thought Bridget was a femboy and some people actually played the game. And another thing is that even among the people Dimitri cites, their statements don't quite line up with how he describes them. Gunnamexia's tweet is followed up by them clarifying, "Please understand that this tweet is only the result of one user's interpretation and is not necessarily correct." Maybe Dimitri didn't see this, but this was just someone's headcanon, and it's not only being presented as if it is the commonly held opinion, but the only correct opinion. Akihiro Koyama, who was suspended, RIP, wrote an article about the history of fictional otokonoko, and why making Bridget trans was a decision he personally disagreed with, even linking to one of the articles I mentioned earlier. The foundational premise of his article is that Bridget is trans in her newest iteration. This shows up in Dimitri's video like 3 times. I think it's very clear that whatever perspective from Japanese people we're getting is heavily filtered through Dimitri's own perspective, which isn't a bad thing on its own, but Dimitri's perspective doesn't really hold any water, so this just comes across as an attempt to bolster his legitimacy. There's another general problem with this video. One question that arose from this is, did Dimitri Monroe actually play Guilty Gear Strive? The answer seems to be a little bit, but he clearly didn't play the parts he talks about in this video. Let me explain. Before he planned on making this video, Dimitri Monroe seems to have implied he never bought the game. He tweeted, "An entire year of me saying no Bridget no buy has finally come to fruition," and later, "No Bridget no buy, and this is not my Bridget." Dimitri has since attempted to revise this claim, saying, "Never really played it on PC, so I think I can refund it over there," in which he refers to the fact that you can refund any game on Steam that you bought in the last few weeks and played less than 2 hours of. He also adds that he played it on PS initially, did not like it, got it on PC when a character he liked was announced. For this video, we are going to assume good faith and honesty where possible, so let's say that Dimitri Monroe played through every bit of the game a year ago on PlayStation, and it does seem to be the case that the gameplay footage featured in the video is his own, which he played on PC. However, even granting that, it is impossible for him to play all these sections he talks about in less than 2 hours. Getting to Bridget's endings in Stage 8 and 9 would take somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. Since there's 4 endings at that point, that alone would take almost 2 hours, assuming you played perfectly every time. On top of that, Dimitri references lines in co-op mode, the endings of other characters' arcade modes, and the Japanese dialogue of one of the endings. On top of that, Dimitri likely would have taken time adjusting to the game and learning how to play this all-new character, at least well enough to have beat the arcade mode on high difficulties. And it just seems like there's no possible way for him to play all the stuff he talked about in less than 2 hours. Further evidence of this comes in the fact that much of the background footage in the video repeats itself, sometimes thrice over, which would be strange if Dimitri played through this route 2 or 4 times. Why stretch 10 minutes of footage across a 28-minute video if you have more than that? Even further evidence is the fact that all his footage of the arcade mode endings comes from YouTuber Swim Cheesy, who, for some reason, goes uncredited. Possibly because Dimitri didn't want to imply that he didn't reach the endings himself, possibly because Swim Cheesy also released a video explaining Bridget's story, and concluding she was trans. Either one would have been awkward for him. He also didn't even get the extreme mode ending, and since he doesn't include footage of Save 5, I assume that's where he lost. Sort of cheapens the later part in the video where he says the extreme mode ending is the only true ending. We will ignore that. For a gaming YouTuber, not actually playing the parts of a game you're talking about is a bit of a faux pas. But I'll cut him some slack. It's not impossible for someone to have insight on a game without completing it. You know, there's a really good Lampoot video about that, I liked it. However, I would say that it undermines his claim to authority of the series, and it hampers his ability to understand the format. Namely that all endings are canon and Gold Lewis is encountered twice along the route, though I'll touch more on those later. The beginning of the video starts with Dimitri giving a history of Bridget before Strive and his opinions, however we're gonna skip that bit for now. One of the first things Dimitri brings up are the pronouns used in the glossary and website bio. Get ready for some Japanese lessons.
The female pronouns are completely foregone in the Japanese release.
This, while True is misleading. Japanese is a pro-drop language, meaning a language where pronouns may be omitted where inferable. It's actually very rare to see the use of third-person pronouns in Japanese. So to say they are foregone implies an ambiguity or specific avoidance of female pronouns, whereas in reality that's just how every female character is referred to. For English, it's almost impossible to talk about a character without using third-person pronouns. In fact, every other bio in the English glossary uses pronouns in this section, so they can't exactly change the format just for this. Dimitri also later says,
while the English makes itself as awkward as possible by never using a single pronoun for Bridget.
So he complains when they use pronouns, and complains when they don't. Dimitri also claims,
in fact, the Japanese bio directly states the character is a man.
The line in question says otoko no ko de aru, and I need to give a detailed breakdown of that one because it's a major sticking point. Otoko no ko, not to be confused with the other otoko no ko, literally means male child. This is always translated as boy because saying male child in English sounds a lot more stiff than boy, and otoko no ko does not carry a stiff connotation. De aru in this case is ambiguous. In spoken Japanese in most contexts, it's basically Japanese for is, but written Japanese has many different grammatical structures, which include using deru regardless of implied tense, so this part could either mean is or was. This is also part of a sentence referring to Bridget's past, specifically Bridget's birth and how she was raised, so it's completely reasonable to translate this as Bridget was born male, which is not an unusual way to talk about a trans woman, at least in English. So, well, what about in Japanese? And to answer that question, I have selected 3 genre-defining characters who are canonically and arguably trans. Hibari Ozora, Shuichi Nitori, and Kiyoharu Suirenji. And I went and looked at what is written about them on both Japanese Wikipedia and the Pixiv Dictionary. And you can see, for all these characters, they are described with otoko or otoko no ko. This is one of the most important things I want people to take away from this video. Japan has a very different way of talking about transgender topics than us, which is easy to misinterpret if you come at it from a Western lens. Whereas we're more likely to only talk about a person's gender identity, Japan doesn't shy away from talking about a person's biological sex. Considering this bio in the translation was also later used in the developer's backyard where they say Bridget is a woman, it's clear retroactively that this translation was completely accurate, but even for the time, Dimitri's characterizations of the text and the translation were incorrect. On its own, it is ambiguous, but Dimitri claims that it is unambiguous, definitive proof that Bridget currently identifies as a man and that the localizers mistranslated it, and that's not true. This part is pretty simple to talk about, even though Dimitri goes on for a while about it. Bridget has a symbol on her hood. This symbol is categorized as male with stroke symbol on most websites, as opposed to female with stroke, me making this video. Dimitri attempts to explain its meaning.
Many have said this is the androgyne symbol, and remarked that it signifies transgender, but even if you believe it is the androgyne symbol, that symbol doesn't mean transgender. It means androgyny.
2 things. The first is that the symbol also means transgender. The page he pulls this image from is LGBT symbol, so that should have been obvious. Contrary to Dimitri's representation that this is a symbol exclusive to or mostly representative of cross-dressing boys, the best you could argue is that this is ambiguous. Where are you coming at it from a Western perspective? However, from the Japanese perspective, which Dimitri's video claimed to be representing, by the way, this symbol has a different meaning. If you check on multiple JP Wikipedia pages, JP Wiktionary, and the Pixiv Dictionary, they all say that the symbol, as well as other versions of the symbol, all have only one meaning: transgender. Dimitri tries to hold his point further by saying,
in Japan, it is frequently used with cross-dressing media. You know, what Bridget is a part of.
He doesn't provide any examples of this. The picture he puts up on screen doesn't have the symbol. I don't think he did his research for this one, he just wanted to show a funny image and hoped we'd forget what was going on. This is already at the point where the position of the Bridget skeptic is untenable if you actually look into it. If the designers intended Bridget to be a femboy and chose this symbol as an indication of an androgynous character rather than a trans character, where would they have learned of the alternate Western meaning of the symbol, and why would they have chosen to use it despite it being commonly understood as a trans symbol in their home country? It wouldn't make any sense. This is also where you can already start to see the lens through which Dimitri filters information. He stripped the ambiguity from evidence when it suited him and proclaimed ambiguity where it contradicted him. It was at one point a common argument by Bridget skeptics that the line where Bridget says, "I'm a girl," takes place in a bad ending. Dimitri upheld this position in his video, but later claimed that he never said that. When I posted this section of the video, Dimitri blocked me. I can see that I offended him and I deeply apologize, so I will do my best here not to mischaracterize his words in the matter. Let's set the record straight. Does Dimitri say there are bad endings?
The one part I will concede is maybe bad ending isn't exactly the best way to describe it.
Alright, guess he doesn't, you got me.
These are bad endings.
Don't call them bad endings, but they are bad endings? Like, what? Whatever. Well, look past however Dimitri wants to label the endings to how he actually describes them.
This took place in a non-canon dialogue exchange, but it's dialogue that only occurs if you lose or do not play on the higher difficulties, leading to a character's unfinished or failed arc. The perfected extreme run's outcome completely overwrites the other stopping points, both literally and narratively. They are not meant to coexist.
So, according to Dimitri, these endings cannot coexist, so some must be non-canon. Specifically, anything not part of the extreme route is not canon. Any ending that is not part of that route is also a negative ending. Amazing. Every word of what he just said was wrong. Guilty Gear actually has a long history of making as many endings canon as possible, which was only bolstered by the arcade modes in Guilty Gear Xrd, Sign, Revelator, and Rev 2, where every cutscene is canon to the story mode. Dimitri seemingly only played XX, where, while most of the endings are canon, a small few are definitely not, so he is completely unaware of this. This is why I think he should have played the game before making this video, because he's clearly missing a lot of context. There are plenty of times where the extreme route cutscenes reference events from the hard and normal routes, such as with Jacko. In Ending 1, the other Jacko says, "Am I seriously the only adult here?" which is a line the main Jacko references in Stage 7's extreme mode, saying, "Maybe you are the adult here." Furthermore, the assertion that the hard and normal routes are failures or overridden is wrong, all because of Chip. See, in Chip's arcade mode, he finds out about Nagoriyuki. This is followed up on in Angie's arcade mode, where he convinces Angie to help make Nagoriyuki their friend. In Angie's extreme mode endings, Nagoriyuki escapes Angie without becoming friends with either of them. In the Stage 7 Heartlast ending though, which is the same one where Bridget says she's a girl, Chip and Angie succeed in becoming friends with Nagoriyuki. This is not only the more positive ending, but the more conclusive one. It's also the ending that gets referenced elsewhere. Testament's normal and hard endings imply a friendship between Nagoriyuki and Chip. So yeah, all endings are canon, not all bad endings are negative, and not all good endings are the stopping point. I should also mention once again that this was all confirmed later by the developer's backyard, but this should not be characterized as the developers revealing something that the fandom was not previously aware of. Everyone knew that all the endings were canon. It was even stated on the wiki that Stride's arcade mode cutscenes were just like the ones in Xrd, which is to say, all canon. This wasn't even in contention before Bridget skeptics tried to claim it as a talking point, so Dimitri was clearly wrong even for the time. I shan't labor on this point much longer, but Dimitri also mischaracterizes the events of this ending.
For Bridget's lost route, it sees him going along with how someone else viewed him. Someone who kept insisting he was a woman no matter how many times Gold Lewis was corrected.
Except that's not true. Gold Lewis apologizes the first time he's corrected, and then the second time he corrects himself. He's not insisting that Bridget should be a woman. If anything, Bridget is going against Gold Lewis, calling her a boy. It gets worse though. This next section is pretty bad, especially for someone who is studying Japanese and shows a clear talent for it, like Dimitri. If this wasn't intentional, he seems to have either half remembered a lot of the things he's talking about, or he took unreliable info from secondhand sources. Let me just show you.
You see, in Japanese it's most common, when referring to oneself, to say I'm a man or woman, when talking about your actual gender, such as Bridget saying otoko earlier, while I'm a boy or girl is used when talking about one's role.
Dimitri references a lot of English sources to back up this claim, but not any Japanese sources, unless you count the person who said they were just talking about their headcanon. Japanese perspective, by the way. Think like a video editor here. If you're trying to communicate and prove something to your audience, what do? Well, you'd probably put images up on screen that evidence your claims, but during this section he doesn't put up anything on screen. The reason is because this doesn't really happen. There are otakonoko who call themselves girls in their series, however, there's always context behind it that explains why it's not just them telling a silly little joke. And lacking any sources to prove his point, Dimitri then brings up the opposite of what he was talking about.
This way of speaking is often why you have characters like Fate's Mordred referring to themselves as the other gender in this way, in order to affirm their desired place in society.
Funny thing about that, I remember the scene, and you know what word was used? Onna.
しかし、アーサー王の息子モードレットが女だったとは。
次に俺を女と呼べば、俺は自分を制御できん。わかった。
What the hell?
Or even a situation like Nato from Persona 4, where people will try to use this phrasing to misrepresent the character.
Now, I'm going to show you the Japanese audio that contradicts what Dimitri is saying.
そもそも男じゃないのに、強い大人の男になんてなれるわけないだろ。
直人君、 女の子だったんだね。
So that's a contradiction in what Dimitri's talking about in both ways.
If you read eroge or other lewd material, you might also be familiar with this, as it can sometimes be used to denote the top or bottom person in the sexual act.
Not only is this sexual roleplay and taunting, not only is it one character referring to another character rather than referring to themselves, in the images provided they're saying female instead of girl. I don't want to labor on any of these, but his own examples contradict him. They're all nearly the opposite of what he's saying, on top of not really being equivalent to Bridget's situation. That aside, there's two things I want to analyze about this ending that Dimitri leaves out. One is asking the question that no one seems to have asked, which is, how do trans characters talk about themselves in Japanese media? Because if they use the same language that Bridget does, wouldn't that imply that Bridget is meant to be trans? At least by Dimitri's logic. Let me just take a look. Who was I talking about earlier? Oh yeah, Kiyoharu Surenji. What does she say about her gender? Well, here she says, because I'm a girl. That sounds familiar. What else? I'm a girl. I want to be a girl. Wow, she sure is using the word girl a lot. You'd think that's common for trans characters or something. What about Shuichi Nitori? Well, the thing is, her manga is a bit of a slow burn. She didn't say she wants to be a girl until like chapter 9, even then she implies it. But the mangaka really wanted to get it across that she's trans from the first chapter, so as not to mislead the audience, you know. So you know what she did? She titled the first chapter, Boku wa Onanoko, which means, I'm a girl. The creator of the most influential trans manga of all time thought the clearest and most universally understandable way to communicate that the main character was a trans girl was to use the phrase, I'm a girl. I feel like this speaks for itself, so honestly this should have been brought up by someone, probably. The second thing is analyzing the context of when Bridget says she's a girl. In that ending, Bridget had just said, if I keep on faking it like this, I know I'll regret it. So from now on, no matter what, no more lying to myself. And then, Ojo-chan is fine, because I'm a girl. This, in its entirety, is incompatible with the idea that it's insincere or reliant on some specific gender language, since she uses more than one gender term. I mean, if it was, then she would be contradicting herself, right? You can pick out any individual sentence from this and try to explain it away, but taken as a whole, there is no other conclusion to come to. Here we are now in the reading comprehension and media analysis section. Yeah, this also contains lessons about Guilty Gear canon. Let's begin. Dimitri describes the Stage 9 ending as follows.
Bridget won't change for anyone. He is happy with who he is, a sentiment that echoes much of his original narrative up to this point. Furthermore, I've seen plenty of people try to misrepresent the true ending as an extension of the I'm a girl line. But that doesn't make any sense. The dialogue specifically states, no matter what others think. And do you know what others think? They think he's a girl, and that has always been the case. Jam and Potemkin are the only ones who didn't. It's an assertion that he will always be himself, even if the way he's treated by others contrasts that view.
Now, again, we know this isn't true because all endings are canon. However, let's pretend we don't believe that for a second. Even if we say only the extreme route is canon, Dimitri's interpretation runs into a few problems, and some of them stem from his earlier recounting of Bridget's history in the series. This is something I skipped over earlier, partially because understanding Bridget's history isn't actually strictly necessary to understanding her Strive incarnation, and partially because Dimitri circles back to the media interpretation here, so let's clear some things up. Guilty Gear XX and its updated accent core versions are a bit of a weird spot for Guilty Gear lore. Neither were written by Daisuke and both suffer for it, but while X2 is mostly filler and retreads, it also introduced some of the most important characters in the series, such as Ino and Bridget. The accent core versions, however, are almost entirely not canon. While the fans consider the PWAB entries canon compliant, almost every character has something in their routes contradicted by later entries. Furthermore, it is not referenced in Strive's GG World, which goes into extreme detail regarding every event and relationship in the series. So while Dimitri brought accent core up, I will mostly be ignoring it. So with just X2 to go off of, what kind of character is Bridget? I would say that Bridget is primarily motivated by love for her family and perhaps a passion for bounty hunting, but is otherwise fairly simplistic and naive. Even Bridget's whole gender gimmick, which Dimitri claims is the crux of the character, is not only minimal in this first appearance, but even that is merely a showcase of Bridget's familial love and shallowness. Bridget dresses like a girl because of her parents, and she goes out to destroy the superstition and expose her biological sex because she didn't want her parents to feel guilty. In the course of this, Bridget encounters Johnny, Dizzy, and Kai. It is canon that all of these things happen, but the most important one for this is Kai. Because of Kai, Bridget was able to bring home a lot of money to her village, and as confirmed by Strive, she caused the superstition to fade once and for all. With this, we can already see a contradiction with Dimitri's characterization. Most of the characters Bridget has interacted with, most importantly the village she calls home and her own family, know her as a boy. But we can go even further with this. Let's say We don't know what ending from the first game's canon. Let's say we're all very silly. Either way, in her second encounter with Gold Lewis, it's expressed that Bridget is hiding her true self, and she even mentions she hasn't told her parents. This is something expanded upon during the intro to Stage 9, where Kai says he didn't want to lie to himself or his family, intending to draw a parallel with Bridget's experience. Since both Gold Lewis and her parents know that she's male at this point, and everyone has seen her feminine side, what true self could Bridget be hiding? What could she be lying about? The only answer the game seems to give us is that she's a girl. The Dimitri theory doesn't hold up. And with the context of the previous games held in mind, I want to circle back to that line because it's important to ask this funny little question. How did the story in X2 communicate Bridget's biological sex? Because the truth is that in the original Japanese script, Bridget never really does come out and say it. Instead, Bridget primarily does two things. One, Bridget acts indignant to being called Ojo-san, and two, Bridget uses boku as a first-person pronoun.
お嬢さんじゃありません。僕は賞金稼ぎです。
To explain what that means, Ojo is a formal Japanese word that means young lady, usually referring to wealthy high-class female characters. Boku is one of many Japanese first-person pronouns that has its place in the complicated web of age, gender, and formality, but for this context, simply put, it's primarily used by young men. Which is why Bridget's line at the end of her arcade mode is especially meaningful in Japanese. Not only is she fully accepting being called Ojo-chan, she's using uchi, which in this context is a feminine pronoun. Both of the ways she used to assert a male identity are dropped at the same moment she declares I'm a girl. It's funny actually how it only becomes more blatant that Bridget identifies as a girl if you look into the history of the series and the meaning in Japanese, but Dimitri is here trying to sell you the opposite story. That's how wrong he is. Death of the author is a concept that exists. I like to believe I've pretty clearly proven that even without holding on to developer intention, it's pretty unambiguous that Bridget is supposed to be trans. However, Dimitri's next arguments are, among other things, about statements made by the developers and localization staff, so we'll be beating him on his own terms.
Given how the localization, in several instances, went out of its way to contradict the original text in order to assert this trans narrative.
I've already addressed most of this in the previous sections, so, no, they didn't. The translation is not only accurate, but it completely maintains the developer's intentions.
You have Bridget's English voice actress tweeting out that the character is trans.
Dimitri doesn't add that other members of the localization staff also said this. I don't know why. I'll talk more about this later, but as an argument regarding Bridget, I do agree that the localization side saying this shouldn't be treated as definitive or unquestionable proof. However, people who worked on the JP side also said similar things, like Aisha, the bilingual singer for Bridget's theme, agreeing with a tweet calling the song a trans-femme anthem, or the PR manager and marketing director Riku Ozawa mentioning during an official livestream on August 9th that Bridget's story mode was about her gender identity, and then immediately talking about how Bridget and the trans Evo champion Umi show will help people such as himself learn more about the subject, which feels very blatant. I don't think that either of these two would be the word of God on the subject either, though I'd argue Ozawa's statements count for something, but the idea that the localization staff alone were trying to spread a false narrative was always a ridiculous one. And on the contrary, not a single staff member at ArcSys said that Bridget was a femboy, or made any statements that would be considered unusual for a trans character. There's also something to be said about the complete silence on the fact that Bridget was explicitly trans in the English version compared to how quickly they debunked the fake email claiming the opposite, but we'll get to that one later. Oh, and this one, this is where it gets funny.
You had people on social media try to say Daisuke Ishiwatari, the original director of the series, drew a trans rights picture of Bridget as a statement, when the actual story was a fan asked for it, where in said story, Daisuke was actually confused about what he was even writing.
Dimitri, what does gears turning in his head mean? Hold on, let me Google it. Let's see, referring to a person, they are thinking and coming to revelations and conclusions. Alright, so yeah, I would say that revelations and conclusions sound like a person who is understanding something. And Dimitri is saying that Daisuke was confused. He doesn't even try to say, oh, this person's an unreliable narrator, oh, it's just fan art, it's not actually in the game. He editorializes a tweet that we're seeing right in front of us. What are you doing, man?
So many of these people will try to speak on this man's words. But do you know how he actually described Bridget?
Yes, actually. In a November 2021 Famitsu interview, when he was asked about Bridget, he answered, Bridget is still a bounty hunter, and Bridget is now trying to figure out who Bridget really is. This is implying that Bridget's previous self-identity will be questioned by the narrative, and perhaps Bridget will reach a different conclusion by the end. But that's not what Dimitri is referring to. Apparently he didn't know about this one.
Well, let's take a look at an interview from a while back. Daisuke states, while I was creating the characters in Guilty Gear, I had a spot for a cute character. I thought it would be too boring if the character was just cute, so I thought it would be interesting to make the character a guy.
This is from a 2009 interview that was translated into English, for which Dimitri does not provide a source or the original Japanese text. Gee, what argument should I use for this one? Dimitri insists that we can't trust localizers, then trust a localizer for this? 13 years have passed since this interview? No, I had to pull out the big guns for this one. Unfortunately, your mother. After this point, Dimitri stops making arguments about Bridget not being trans, and it's not where his video or mine will end, but I just want to have a look back at what's already here. Through exhaustive detail, I've shown that even without the information given to us by the developer's backyard, everything he said to bolster his argument was either wrong or misleading. And all of these parts of the video are still up for anyone to see, even after the developer's backyard. When he re-uploaded the video, he didn't cut out any of the misinformation, he only cut out a section that was mostly just his opinion. I want to clarify, I don't think that anyone who made any of these arguments was inherently acting in bad faith. It's more likely that most of the thousands of people involved just repeated talking points from people they trusted. But for the people who invented some of these claims, I definitely think that many of them were intentionally spreading misinformation. And for Dimitri himself, who repeated every claim, well, I won't attribute his actions to malice, but the most generous interpretation I could apply to this is that he didn't research this at all, and didn't try to see perspectives other than his own. And for a video attempting to be informative, I think that's nearly as intellectually dishonest as just lying on purpose. So the only question I can think to ask is, why? Why was Dimitri so wrong? Why was every Bridget skeptic so wrong? Why were they even willing to argue about this, even though they were all completely, totally wrong? Alright, this part is half as long as the last one, but it's 10 times as important, so pay attention! I suppose I should clarify before I go deeper into this analysis, but there are some aspects of the Bridget controversy that go beyond arguing about a character's gender. It's not like apocalyptic, as some people have portrayed it, but people have been harassed, there's been massive misinformation campaigns. Basically, a lot of people think that Bridget matters more than their own actions, when I think it's the other way around. On August 25th, a few weeks after Bridget was released, but before the developer backyard, there was this whole fake email scheme. Someone on 4chan's V-board faked not just an email from ArcSys support, but also a tweet from a private Japanese account containing the email. The email alleged that Bridget was a boy who accepted her feminine side. From there, the image popped up on Twitter where people went wild with it for a few hours. I could tell immediately it was bullshit. I've seen people get emails regarding the situation. It was just basic, we can't answer questions like this shit. The source was questionable, and the diction used was clearly not that of an ArcSys employee making an official statement. Of course, I was right, as I am about literally everything, because just a few hours later, both official ArcSys accounts warned about fake emails being spread around. Dimitri himself contributed to the spread of the fake email, only to later delete his tweet after it was confirmed to be fake. He never issued a correction on the matter. The Twitter account featured in this image was someone completely unrelated to any of this, who was just used as an attempt to feign legitimacy and hide the actual source. So they got harassed and spammed as a result of this by people asking for more information regarding the email, basically for no fucking reason. Like, it wasn't enough that there was harassment, it wasn't enough that there was rampant transphobia, it wasn't enough that every Bridget stan was accused of being a groomer. The Bridget skeptics had to do something so extreme that ArcSys themselves made a statement about it. That's how fucked this is. And it's not like this motivation to argue about gender of characters came out of nowhere. It's just with Bridget, for some reason, she caused the biggest stir about it. You can see a lot of the same players involved having dabbled in this stuff and making a lot of the same misleading arguments, only sometimes they were technically right about their conclusions. Like, I don't think any of these characters are canonically trans, but there are times where people ignore their ambiguity, ignore the content that counters their assumptions, ignore the times they were changed by localizers. Dimitri is perhaps notorious for this. While I don't disagree with many of his conclusions, his arguments are lacking and sometimes wrong. He strips ambiguity from characters all the time, even in this video, and then lambasts people for it. That's not to mention that ambiguous gender characters are a staple of Japanese media and are often erased by American localizers, which is an interesting subject in and of itself, and Dimitri is basically just ignoring it and doing the exact same thing. But hey, I can't really make a video where I go, he's technically not wrong the whole time. That's fucking boring. And I don't think the future is gonna change, even without the context of the things people have said after this. Just this history is enough to convince me that the well-poisoned character gender debates, they're not gonna stop. That's why I think it's important not just to debunk their arguments, but to point out why they do this. But the question is, why do they do this? If they're so willing to be wrong, some of them even willing to lie, what is it that they value more than the truth? And I think I found the clearest answer in the strangest place. Naoto Shirogane and Chihiro Fujisaki are two characters constantly brought up in character gender debates, which is weird to me because they're pretty obviously not trans. Unless you assume the backstory given by Monokuma is a lie and Chihiro's appearances in extra modes aren't reflective of the character in the canon game modes, it's not even ambiguous on his side. And for Naoto, her story seems pretty clearly about rejecting transition, realizing it's not for her. So it makes you wonder, why do people argue that? And I think the most illuminating answer to that question would be this image, which comes up up as one of the first results when you Google Naoto Chihiro. It's a fan art of the two characters, literally explaining the motivation behind the arguments. It levies the accusation that the companies behind these characters are transphobic, that they could never create accurate depictions of trans people, and says that these characters should be reclaimed as a result. And what this says implicitly is that the person behind it, and likely everyone else who argues these things, what they want is accurate depictions of trans people. These characters are not that. And when I think about this, I just imagine someone playing through these games, getting to the point where a character's biological sex is revealed, assuming the character is trans, being unchallenged for the length of an hour of cutscenes or a tough boss fight, and then for the character to say they're not actually trans, rather that their actions were born from insecurity. Which is to say, these arguments about the gender identity of these characters don't stem from any sort of Watsonian interpretation of the canon, but because some people are disappointed that the characters are not trans. All that to say, Dimitri and every other Bridget skeptic feels the same way, just in reverse. This is the reason why after the developer's backyard, most of them immediately just shifted to saying that it was bad writing, because that was their real opinion all along, or at least the subconscious truth behind it. The skepticism of the Bridget skeptics wasn't a practice of curiosity, but an act of desire. The reason why this changed things at all when the evidence was already overwhelming was that, well, now you can debunk their viewpoints in the span of a single sentence. Daisuke said she's a woman. The only argument against that would be, well, the same arguments they've made fun of when people make them about Naoto or Chihiro. Once they realize that, they come to their final conclusion. They didn't like the writing. And they don't like the writing because they wanted Bridget to stay a femboy. Much like the people who wanted Naoto or Chihiro to be trans, they built up their expectations of Bridget as a femboy, only for many years instead of just an hour, which may explain why the debate got so big and why people seem so invested. Another parallel I want to propose not as an attack but as a defense. Many of the same people who say Naoto and Chihiro are trans have likely been hurt by transphobia, perhaps specifically propaganda aimed to make them stop identifying as trans. And I have seen a decent amount of Bridget skeptics being quite public with their fears of grooming and pink pilling, some even speaking from personal experience. It's, again, the same thing, but in reverse. Knowing this helps one to understand and sympathize with their motivations, but it also doesn't make them right. And if I can take a quick aside, the critical nature of this video may lead people to misinterpret my intentions. This isn't a defense of the writing in Strive, nor is it an attack on people's preferences and headcanons. I don't care too much if you think the writing is bad, I don't care at all if you desire or prefer a specific type of representation, and I absolutely do not care if you headcanon a character to be different than they are in the actual canon. I mean, hell, speaking as someone who has created a character that became a prolific symbol for closeted trans women, I would not and have not cared when people in my comments interpreted this character as a tomboy or femboy or trans guy or non-binary or whatever. Bo, well, she's not a real person. Go wild. But I do have problems with lying or with spreading misinformation and with trying to push your own flawed fan interpretation as the only valid interpretation, shouting down and shutting out anyone who disagrees. And as I've said before, many Bridget skeptics were simply misled, so this may not be the case with a lot of them, but it's undeniable that this was the motivation for many of them, and perhaps the subconscious driver for all the rest, Dimitri included, and I think there's no better way to prove that point than to talk about some of the other parts of his video. While Dimitri spends most of his video talking about whether or not Bridget is trans, he also perhaps accidentally relays a very scathing message during it.
So I think anyone who genuinely cares about this character, or this series, or is just paying attention, can see what you're being sold on social media is manipulation of the narrative.
He paints the opposition as deliberately being dishonest, as manipulating the narrative, and he tries to pretend that his interpretation is on the side of the larger fan base when in reality it wasn't.
You have Bridget's English voice actress tweeting out that the character is trans, and this isn't the first of its kind, where we see a voice actor speaking on behalves they do not have, with this situation seeming very much the same, though feeling more malicious, given how the localization, in several instances, went out of its way to contradict the original text in order to assert this trans narrative.
He does the same to the localization staff, deliberately painting targets on the backs of the most vocal members and portraying the whole thing as malicious. People who are just doing their jobs, in this case better than Dimitri would have in the same situation, are malicious, apparently. And this is the same video where he rightfully calls out harassment of artists and fans.
As it is so often in an attempt to erase an identity. We've seen this with Estofo, Felix, Gwendolyn, as well as so many others. A single instance removed of context, yet contradicts so many other statements from the character and creators. You even find some of them proudly going completely mask off with their intentions, stating how this trans assertion is some great correction to a wrong of the past, how they're going to come for Estofo next, how they need to erase Otokonoko culture. This was never about Bridget the character, the story, This is about erasing an identity.
He relates this to previous character gender dramas and takes the words of crazy people on Twitter to equate believing that Bridget is trans with erasing femboys entirely. I think this represents the mindset of not all, but many Bridget skeptics. It's not about Bridget, it's about misandry, about hawkishly enforcing gender roles, about attacking an identity. And that's ridiculous, right? I mean, if you said to Dimitri, this isn't about Naoto, it's about transphobia, he would laugh at you, he'd insult you, and yet here he is, doing the same thing, but in reverse. He's sitting here attaching negative traits onto the opposition and positive traits onto his supporters, and the language is just apocalyptic. But it goes even deeper. There was a section of this video he deleted on September 14th. He claimed it was because it was the only section that was wrong, but this section was, again, mostly just his opinion, except for one part. One part that sounds really bad when you hear it, and I think because a huge portion of his audience did see it in the week when the video was up, it's worth criticizing for the message it left. In his own words.
So, to repeat what I said numerous times in these sorts of videos, if you care about these things, it's important to get your voice out there, your concerns, your beliefs. Reach out to the Japanese creators, the companies. Don't sit on some message board, whining into the abyss just because people will mock you for doing something, for caring. Oftentimes we've seen creators be just as grateful to those that stick up for their work. So please, always stick up for Bridget.
So good on him for cutting this part out, but this really shouldn't have been in there in the first place. This was a call to action. It was him saying, don't stop arguing about this. Don't stop fighting this everywhere you can. I think this is an incredibly irresponsible thing to say after making a video where you not only spread misinformation, but portray the opposition as intentionally malicious and sinister. That's part of why I've been repeating that I want to assume Dimitri acts in good faith and just made a bunch of mistakes, because I don't want to do what Dimitri did. But it's hard for me to see this video as anything else but an action of personal desire, and to see his desires upheld by others. His primary motivation was wanting his interpretation of Bridget as a femboy to be the interpretation, the majority interpretation, the quote-unquote correct interpretation. This desire made him short-sighted to the flaws in his video or the anger with which it was made. And perhaps worst of all, it made a hypocrite of him, because this is behavior that, were it coming from the other side, he would wholeheartedly condemn. But I guess that just goes to show, both Dimitri and the people he mocks, well, they're only human. They are just as subject to the pull of desire and bias as anybody else. And again, it hasn't even stopped after this. No one took this debate as an opportunity to reflect and gain a new perspective. No one is going, well, now that I've been wrong, I see the people who were wrong before weren't malicious, they were just like me. No, it's all fuck you. There are some people who aren't even admitting to being wrong. Some of the people I've talked about in this video even, some people think the new interview was mistranslated or that the old arguments still hold up, or who say death of the author, who really never gave a fuck in the first place. I don't care about these people. I mean, sure, they're definitely hypocritical and wrong, but they can have their headcanons and they're a minority. It doesn't really matter. A surprising amount of people have used the Bridget controversy as a platform to just spread anti-trans propaganda. Like, I'm not even joking. There are people spreading misinformation that portrays trans people as a uniquely privileged minority in such a way that it would clearly foster negative attitudes towards them because of Bridget. You can see here this lady who thinks that Bridget was changed because of China. She says that trans people are not censored on Chinese TV, which is not true. Jen Xing, who this person constantly cites as an example, has been censored, was banned off Chinese television, and was recently banned off Weibo. She then goes on to say that they forcibly transitioned gay men. Her proof of this being an article about how common transgender conversion therapy is in China. I'm not sure if anybody knew this, but forced transition and trans conversion therapy are literally opposite things. I should make a video on conversion therapy. No one seems to know what it actually is. And then there's the third category of former Bridget skeptics who took a part in spreading this misinformation. Instead of, retracting their videos, issuing corrections, being a good sport, they're all just keeping their videos up, saying they were never all that wrong, and arguing how the writing sucks now. Dimitri even said the only thing that was wrong was the conclusion, which we know is not true, but really? Not even the stuff about bad endings, the thing the developers said was wrong? You're not gonna admit you messed that one up? And I'll grant him that not everything was wrong. He was right about the Twitter reactions about artists being harassed and about Pixiv mistranslating that article. But that's it. That's basically 3 Hero Hey videos stacked on top of each other. Not just on Hero Hey, by the way, because at least he actually did correct himself. Dimitri has also said he plans to make a general follow-up video about how he was right. I will be watching for that one with great interest. In the meantime, I hope Dimitri has fun with DNF Duel. This stuff is all funny, in a way. If you ignore the propaganda, that part is less funny. A lot of people are being hypocritical here because if this behavior was displayed by the other side, they would be mocked relentlessly, but no one cares. This is the truth behind these huge vitriolic debates about trans or femboy characters. It's just based on attachment to the idea of the character representing a certain identity. People will deny reality and try to force their view of art to be accepted as the only view, and no matter what they go through, they'll never reflect on their own action. They'll never think about the faults or hypocrisy on their side, and they'll never just stop arguing and move on. And that fucking blows, I think. And that's the video! To tell you the truth, I've been working on this one since literally the day after Dimitri's video came out. Glad I finished it, wish I could have done it earlier. But hopefully I did a good job to make this applicable beyond just Bridget. You know, whether you're someone who likes to argue about the gender of fictional characters, or if you want to know why people argue about the gender of fictional characters. It's not always a bad thing, by the way. Sometimes it's useful. I mean, obviously I'm doing it right now. I do it on Twitter if I think I can be informative or funny. Just a lot of the time it blows. I shouldn't repeat myself though. I think people could really learn from this situation. Be more empathetic to someone who feels like they're not represented, or don't throw a fit when someone jokes about a character being some other identity than what they really are. I think people's feelings do matter, but fictional characters, they don't matter that much. Oh, and next time someone tries to tell you, oh, the localizers are doing this and that, the character is so-and-so, and they were just completely fucking wrong the last time something like this happened, just double check and make sure they haven't made another mistake. It doesn't hurt to go to someone who double checks and really values being right, get their opinion. Maybe also check what the other side is really saying instead of just what people say they're saying. And don't dismiss the other side just because 1 or 3 people are bad at arguing. I see a lot of people who are right about something, but their arguing skills could use some work. Give them a chance. That's a universal tip. Look shit up, be nice, don't be stupid, don't trust YouTubers. Anyway, special thanks to Dune Queen and Animal Jason, 2 people without whom this video would not have been made. I've actually been doing a lot of streams with Animal Jason recently, so you should go check out his channel. And thanks to my patrons. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.